Officer Christian Allen was 5 seconds away from quitting the police force. He was standing in the corner of a warm bakery, staring at his phone, ready to send the text that would end his career. He thought he was done with the job, until a freezing 7-year-old girl walked in with a starving dog and asked a question that stopped him dead in his tracks. "Grab your coffee and stay with me," because the answer to her question didn't just feed a dog, it broke a grown man's heart and put it back together. It was a slow Tuesday inside the Gilded Crumb, the kind of afternoon where the time seems to stretch out and get stuck. The bakery was warm and smelled of yeast and expensive coffee, a sharp contrast to the biting wind outside that was whipping down Riverside Avenue. Robert Campbell was behind the counter, rubbing a spot on the glass display case with a rag, trying to look busy because he knew the owner watched the security cameras from his house. Robert was tired, his feet ached in his stiff work shoes, and he was mentally counting down the minutes until he could clock out and go home to his own dog, a golden retriever named Buster who would be waiting for him at the door. Behind him, Catherine Moore was leaning against the back counter, texting her boyfriend and popping her gum, completely checked out of her shift. It was boring, it was quiet, and it was safe, which was exactly why Officer Allen was hiding in the corner near the window. He wasn't there for a donut. He was there because he needed 5 minutes where nobody was screaming at him, nobody was bleeding, and nobody was lying to his face. He just wanted to be a regular guy in a warm room, but the universe had other plans for him that day. Hi, my amazing friends and family. Welcome back to Vigilant Heart Tales. Before we jump deep into today's story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing all your names and countries. And don't forget to check out the other stories on the channel. Tomorrow I've got another crazy one coming that I know you'll enjoy. Alright, let's get into it. The bell above the door didn't ring with its usual cheerful sound because the person entering pushed the door open so tentatively that it barely made a noise. A rush of cold air swept into the shop, cutting through the warmth and making the napkins on the counter flutter. Robert looked up, ready to put on his customer service smile, but the smile died on his face before it even fully formed. Standing on the welcome mat was a little girl who looked like she had walked straight out of a nightmare. She was small, maybe 7 years old, wearing a puffy pink coat that was so covered in grime it looked gray. She wasn't wearing boots for the snow. She was wearing thin canvas sneakers that were soaked through, and her ankles were bare and red from the freezing cold. She was shivering, a full-body tremor that made her look like she was vibrating, but she wasn't alone. Clutched in her small, chapped hand was a piece of yellow nylon rope, and at the end of that rope was a dog that looked less like a pet and more like a bundle of dirty wire. It was a terrier mix, matted and skinny, with its tail tucked so far between its legs it was practically touching its stomach. The bakery went completely silent as everyone stared at the girl and the dog. Officer Allen saw them in the reflection of the window, but he didn't turn around because his first instinct was annoyance. He squeezed his phone tighter, thinking that he just wanted 5 minutes of peace without having to deal with a lost kid or a runaway or a social services nightmare. He told himself it was the shop owner's problem, not his, so he kept his back turned and stared at his unsent text message that said, "I think I'm going to quit." He blocked out the sound of the girl's wet shoes squeaking on the tile floor and tried to pretend he was anywhere else. Robert, however, didn't have the luxury of ignoring them. He looked at the girl, then he glanced nervously at the camera in the corner of the ceiling, knowing that his boss, Mr. Henderson, would fire him in a heartbeat for letting a dirty stray dog into a high-end bakery. Robert wasn't a bad person, but he had rent to pay and student loans that were drowning him, so fear made the decisions for him. He walked around the counter, keeping a safe distance, and cleared his throat. "Hey, sweetie," Robert said, his voice dropping to that gentle but firm tone adults use when they are trying to manage a problem. "You can't be in here. You can't bring the dog inside. It's against the health code, and my manager is really strict about it." It was the right thing to say according to the rulebook, but it felt wrong in his gut as soon as the words left his mouth. The girl didn't argue, didn't throw a tantrum, and didn't ask for money. She just looked at him with eyes that were too old for her face, dark circles bruising the skin underneath them. She tightened her grip on the yellow rope as if the dog was the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth. She took a half step back toward the door, pulling the shivering dog with her, and Robert thought she was going to leave. He felt a wave of relief mixed with guilt, reaching for a pamphlet about the local homeless shelter to give her, but then she stopped. She didn't look at the exit. She looked past him at the display case filled with croissants, muffins, and cakes. "I don't have any money," she said, her voice raspy and thin, sounding like she hadn't used it all day. Robert sighed, feeling terrible but trapped by his job. "I know, kid. I'm sorry. We can't give out free food. The inventory is counted every night." He expected her to beg, or to ask for $1, or to ask for a cookie for herself. She looked like she was starving, her cheeks hollow and her little hands shaking from hunger just as much as from the cold. But she didn't ask for any of that. She looked Robert dead in the eye, took a deep breath that rattled in her chest, and asked the question that would change everything. "I don't want the fresh stuff," she whispered, her voice trembling but determined. "Do you have expired food for my dog?" The question hung in the warm air of the bakery, heavy and suffocating. She rushed to get the rest of the words out, terrified he would say no before she finished. "Like the stuff you throw in the dumpster? The stuff that's bad. I don't need good food. I just... Lola hasn't eaten since yesterday morning. I found a bagel, but she ate it and she's still hungry. Please." She looked down at the dog, who let out a low, pathetic whine and nudged her leg. "Do you have any trash for her?" Officer Allen froze. His thumb stopped hovering over his phone screen and his breath hitched in his chest. He had spent 10 years on the force hearing people lie to him, hearing people scream at him, hearing people make excuses for the bad things they did. But he had never heard anything as honest and heartbreaking as a starving child begging for garbage to feed her dog. The words "expired food" bounced around his skull, shattering the wall of indifference he had built up to protect himself. He realized in that split second that she wasn't asking for herself. She was shaking, she was freezing, she was clearly empty, but her only thought was for the scruffy, dirty animal at the end of that rope. It pierced right through his burnout and found the part of him that used to care, the part of him that joined the police academy because he wanted to help people. Robert stood there with his mouth slightly open, looking from the girl to the camera and back again. He looked at the trash bin behind the counter where he had just thrown away a perfectly good tray of scones that were slightly too brown. He wanted to give them to her. He wanted to give her the whole store. But he was paralyzed by the fear of losing his job, imagining his boss yelling at him for feeding strays. I can't," Robert stammered, his voice weak. "The dumpster is locked out back. I don't have the key. I'm so sorry, kid." The girl didn't cry. She didn't get angry. She just nodded, a small, defeated movement that was somehow worse than tears. It was the reaction of a child who was used to the world saying no to her. "Okay," she whispered. "Come on, Lola." She turned around slowly, her wet sneakers squeaking on the floor, and started to drag the reluctant dog back toward the freezing cold wind of the street. She looked so small, so defeated, and so incredibly alone. "Robert!" The name cracked through the silence like a whip. Officer Allen turned around from the window, slipping his phone into his pocket. He didn't look tired anymore. He looked awake. He walked across the bakery floor with heavy, purposeful steps, the sound of his boots loud and commanding. He walked right past the girl and planted himself at the counter, placing his large hands on the marble surface. He didn't look at Mary yet because he knew if he looked at the terror in her eyes, he might break down right there. He focused on Robert. "You have those savory meat pies in the warmer, don't you?" Christian asked, his voice low and rough with emotion. Robert blinked, startled by the sudden intervention. Yes. Yes, officer. 2 of them. But they're fresh." Christian ignored him and pointed a finger at the glass case. "Give me both of them. And the roast chicken sandwich. The big one on the focaccia bread." Robert reached for a bag, his hands shaking slightly. "Okay. Anything else?" Christian looked at the display case, scanning the rows of perfect, sugary treats. His eyes landed on a massive chocolate cake in the center, decorated with fresh strawberries. "Yeah," Christian said. "That cake. The whole thing." Catherine gasped from the back corner. "Officer, that's the premium cake. It's $60. Christian didn't even blink. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his worn leather wallet, slapping his debit card onto the counter. "I didn't ask the price," he said. "And get me a bowl of water. A big soup bowl." Robert stared at him, confused. For you, sir?" Christian turned around then. He turned to face the door where Mary was standing, frozen with her hand on the handle. She was looking at him with wide, terrified eyes, shrinking back against the wall as if she expected him to arrest her for loitering. She pulled Lola behind her legs to protect the dog, her little body trembling. Christian looked at the mud on the floor, he looked at her wet shoes, and he looked at the desperate love she had for that dog. He walked over to her, and despite his bad knees and his heavy utility belt, he lowered himself down until he was kneeling on the floor in front of her. He wasn't a giant cop anymore. He was just a man looking a child in the eye. "Mary, right?" he asked gently. She nodded, too scared to speak. He reached out a hand and let the dirty dog sniff his fingers. "Lola isn't going to eat garbage," Christian said, his voice thick with tears he was fighting back. "And neither are you. Not while I'm here." He pointed to a small table in the warmest corner of the shop. "I just ordered way too much food for one person. I need some help eating it. Do you think you could help me?" Mary stared at him, her lower lip trembling as she realized he wasn't going to hurt her. You bought the fresh stuff," she whispered. Christian smiled, and it was the first real thing he had felt in months. "Only the best," he said. "For my friends." Catherine brought the tray over to the small round table in the corner, and her hands were shaking just a little bit as she set it down because she had never seen a police officer cry before. The smell of the food hit the table like a physical wave, the steam rising from the roasted chicken sandwich and the rich, savory meat pies filling the space between them. Mary didn't sit down immediately. She stood by the chair, looking at the food and then looking at Christian as if she was waiting for the trick, waiting for him to pull it away and laugh at her. It broke Christian's heart to see that hesitation, to see a child who had been trained by the world to expect cruelty instead of kindness. So he pulled out a chair for her and sat down heavily in his own, groaning as his stiff back hit the wood. He took a sip of the black coffee Catherine had placed in front of him, letting the bitterness ground him, and then he nodded at the food and told Mary to go ahead. She didn't grab the sandwich for herself. She didn't even look at the chocolate cake that was sitting there like a dark, sugary mountain. She reached for the hottest meat pie, burning her dirty fingertips on the crust, and she broke it open right there on the tray, blowing on the steam to cool it down. She didn't take a bite. She broke off a massive chunk of the meat and gravy filling and lowered it to the floor for Lola. The dog didn't even chew, she just inhaled the food, her tail thumping a frantic rhythm against the leg of the table that sounded like a drumbeat of pure gratitude. Christian watched them, his coffee cup paused halfway to his mouth, and he felt a lump form in his throat that had nothing to do with the cold or the shift he had just worked. He watched Mary feed the dog almost half the food on the tray before she finally took a small, hesitant bite of the chicken sandwich herself. She closed her eyes when the flavor hit her tongue, her shoulders dropping 3 inches as the tension left her body, and she let out a sound that wasn't quite a moan but was the sound of a stomach realizing it was finally safe to be full. Christian didn't say anything, he just watched her eat, and for the first time in a week, the noise in his head stopped. The radio on his shoulder was turned down, the texts from his sergeant were ignored, and the only thing that mattered in the entire world was making sure this little girl got enough calories to survive the night. He realized then that this was the job, this was what he had signed up for 20 years ago, not the paperwork or the arrests or the politics, but this simple act of standing between a vulnerable person and a hard world. Robert came out from behind the counter, looking sheepish and holding a small cardboard box. He didn't look at the camera in the ceiling anymore. He looked at Mary. He placed the box on the table and mumbled that they could take the leftovers with them, and he even slipped 2 extra cookies into the box when he thought Christian wasn't looking. The atmosphere in the bakery had shifted completely. The stiffness and the fear were gone, replaced by a quiet, warm communion of people just trying to help. Mary ate until she couldn't eat anymore, her cheeks flushed with warmth, and Lola was asleep under the table, her belly full and her breathing heavy and peaceful. Mary wiped her mouth with a napkin, staring at the smear of chocolate frosting on the paper, and then she looked at Christian with a seriousness that made her look 20 years older. She reached into the pocket of her stained pink coat and dug around for a long time, her brow furrowed in concentration. Christian thought she was looking for a tissue or maybe a toy, but she pulled out a single, dull penny. It was dirty and old, the kind of penny people step over on the sidewalk without thinking, but she held it out to him like it was a gold bar. "I can pay," she whispered, her voice steady now that she had food in her belly. "It's all I have, but I found it yesterday. You paid for the fresh stuff. I can give you this." Christian looked at the penny in her small, grimy hand, and he looked at the chocolate on her chin, and he felt like he was going to shatter into a million pieces. He had seen drug dealers throw thousands of dollars at him to look the other way. He had seen politicians trade favors like playing cards, but he had never seen an offer as generous as this. She was offering him literally everything she had in the world to pay a debt she didn't owe. He reached out with his large, rough hand and gently curled her fingers back over the coin, pushing it back toward her chest. "You keep that," he said, his voice rough and thick. "Lola might need a treat tomorrow, and you're going to need to buy it for her. Consider this lunch on me. A police discount." Mary looked at him, confused for a second, and then she smiled. It wasn't a polite smile or a fake smile. It was a real toothy grin that lit up her face and made her look like a 7-year-old girl again instead of a survivalist. "Thank you," she said, and the words carried more weight than any commendation or medal Christian had ever received. He checked his watch and realized his shift was technically over, but he knew he couldn't just let her walk back out into the Chicago winter with nothing but a full stomach. The wind was still howling outside, rattling the window pane, and the sky had turned a dark, charcoal gray. He stood up, his knees popping, and put his cap back on his head, adjusting it so it sat straight. He looked at Robert and Catherine, who were watching from the counter with soft looks on their faces. "I'm going to give them a ride," Christian announced, not asking for permission. "Robert, pack up that cake. She's taking the rest of it." Robert scrambled to box up the cake, moving faster than he had all day. Christian walked Mary to the door, holding it open for her and Lola. The blast of cold air hit them instantly, a cruel reminder that the world hadn't changed just because they had eaten lunch, but Christian stepped out in front of them, blocking the wind with his body. He walked them to his patrol car, parked right at the curb with the lights flashing softly in the gloom. He opened the back door, usually reserved for criminals, and ushered Mary and Lola inside where the heater was already blasting warm air. He got into the front seat and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, listening to the hum of the engine and the quiet breathing of the girl and dog in the back. He pulled his phone out of his pocket one last time. The text message to his wife was still there on the screen. "I don't think I can do this anymore. I think I need to turn in the badge." He stared at the words, remembering how he felt when he typed them, how empty and useless he had felt. Then he looked in the rear-view mirror. Mary was resting her head against the window, watching the city lights blur by, and Lola was curled up on the seat beside her. Christian hit the backspace button. He held it down until every single word of the resignation text disappeared. Then he typed a new message, his fingers moving quickly and surely. "I'm going to be a little late for dinner," he wrote. "I found a couple of friends who need a ride to the shelter on 5th Street. And Sarah, remind me to tell you about a girl named Mary. I think I'm going to stay on the force a little longer." He hit send, tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, and put the car in drive. As he pulled away from the curb, merging into the traffic of Riverside Avenue, he didn't feel burnt out anymore. He felt tired, yes, and he knew the job would still be hard tomorrow, but the heavy weight in his chest was gone. He looked back in the mirror one more time and saw Mary eating a cookie from the box Robert had given her, and for the first time in a long time, Officer Christian Allen drove through the city feeling like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The expired food hadn't been needed, but the expired hope in his own heart had been replaced by something fresh, something real, and something worth fighting for. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. If you enjoyed this story, I promise you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more thrilling as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.